For today's Zen talk, I would like to take a Zen eye on Earth Day. The whole world commemorated what we now know or call as Earth Day a couple of days ago, April 22nd. And every year on this day, April 22nd, since 1970, I believe, this has been a commemoration for people who are of good intention, and it's an invitation for all to celebrate and be grateful for the gifts of earth. Secondly, to lament and decry its impending destruction and its woundedness on so many fronts. And thirdly, it is also a call to action for all good-hearted citizens of earth to address this woundedness and live in a way that does not aggravate the woundedness of earth, but may contribute to its healing. So those are the three themes in commemorating Earth Day: celebrating and being grateful for its gifts, the gift of earth. And we know what that means. We are of earth. We cannot, we ourselves, human beings, come out of the earth and are nourished in our life by the earth. We are earthlings, and the celebration and the gratitude for that is basic to understanding who we are. But at the other side of that is the fact that if we truly open our eyes, we humans have been living on this earth, especially in the last couple of 100 years, in the so-called industrial society or industrial age, in a way that has been able to move in the direction of destroying so much of earth through the toxic wastes that we throw upon our surroundings, through our thoughtless ravaging of the earth's resources, and through our ways of spewing toxic material in the atmosphere, in the waters, and on the land that living organisms are growing. So now we are called to take action to revert that. Fine. So this is something that all human beings are now called to take to heart. The fact that our earth is dying, and we are all now called to take part in a turnaround towards its healing. Whether we can do that is still a big question, because it's now more than 50 years, or ever since Rachel Carson in the 1950s called our attention to the fact that we are living, in our so-called modern civilization, are living in ways that systemically continue to destroy our earth on so many fronts. And we have never yet taken any radical turn from that. We are still going in that direction. Now, my question, the question that many of you may be asking, is what has that to do with our Zen practice? My first response is that our Zen practice precisely brings us right to the heart of this throbbing life called the earth. Because for us, the earth is not something outside over there that we're looking at, or something that we're standing on. It's not our environment, so to speak, that is outside of us, but the earth is us. This is the first point I'd like to invite us all to really see and experience in this suggestion of taking a Zen eye on Earth Day. There is a saying from the 13th century Zen master Dogen that goes, mind is no other than mountains, rivers, the great wide earth, the sun, the moon, the stars. The mind that is being talked about there is not just this intellectual mind, but it is the very heart of who we are. When we use the word mind, which is in an English translation of the Japanese and Chinese word shin, that is actually referring to the very core of our being, that which we are referring to when we ask the question, who am I really? What is this reality that makes me who I am? The most intimate and innermost core of myself. That is what is referred to in this very lame English translation called mind. It's the core of our being itself. The very core of our being is none other than mountains and rivers, the great wide earth, the sun, the moon, the stars. Now, it's easy for us to quote Dogen and say, oh, how beautiful. But our Zen practice is precisely an invitation, not so much to take those beautiful quotes from the Chinese and the Japanese masters, but to really take them as pointers to our very understanding and realization and embodiment of that which we are, the embodiment of that mind itself. So, what does this Zen practice consist in? It consists in taking a posture conducive to stillness, and we are doing that today. Breathing with awareness, so that with each breath we receive the gifts of earth, the gifts of the universe coming into our lungs and into our very bodies, and we receive that for our nourishment. And then we breathe out and give back chemicals and other nutrients that the plants then are able to receive and use for their own life and nutrient. So it is a very exchange of life as we breathe in and we breathe out that we are plunged into. And so as we continue in that process of receiving the gifts of earth and giving back ourselves as our gift back to the earth, we are somehow able to enter into that place where we can find that there is no longer any separation between myself and earth, between myself and what is. As we continue to breathe with awareness and as our mind goes deep into that stillness, to offer some technical words about this, we are able to enter into that place where our subjective consciousness merges with the objective world, and there is no longer any wall between the subject aware of what is outside, because there is no longer any outside, but it is simply an awareness of that which is right here, wherein the self and the object are no longer separate, and it is just this. So, in the midst of that stillness, we are most fully at home with ourselves. In the midst of that stillness, we find true peace, and we find our most intimate interconnectedness with each and everything that exists. Now, in that state of mind, in that state of stillness, wherein the wall between self and not self collapses, when we look at something, it's no longer something outside us. So that the so-called samadhi, that is the state of mind that is cultivated in that mode of awareness, wherein self and other and self and non-self are no longer separate. That mode of awareness takes us to a place where, when we look around us, and it could be a tree, or it could be a leaf, or it could be a bird, or it could be a pebble, that becomes the gateway to that world of non-separation. We read or hear about many stories of people who are in that state of unitive awareness, who are just living out of that state of stillness that is cultivated in our sitting practice. And in those moments, for example, there's a Zen monk who is just sweeping the floor. And so a Zen monk, by understanding, is one who spends many hours of the day in sitting in that stillness. And then they also have their chores, they have their meals, they have their activities. And so this Zen monk was just sweeping the floor and or sweeping the grounds, and there was a pebble that was swept, and then a pebble flew from where the broom flicked it and hit a bamboo pole nearby, and there was a click, and it was that click that became the moment of awakening of the Zen monk. That's the Zen story that we know about. But what is that really saying? These are instances wherein our heart, our mind, our true self opens up, and that wall of separation that I think is there when I look at a tree outside and I think I am here and the tree is out there collapses, and the tree then opens up into that world where there is no separation, or not necessarily a tree, but I know a friend, I have a friend who was also earnest in his sitting. He's a Jesuit, whom I knew way back since my Jesuit days. And for him, somehow in his sitting, the image of a tree stump came up. And it was that tree stump that opened his heart to the reality of his true self. These are lame and fumbling words that I'm offering to invite us to the possibility that, and to the reality that, as we live from day to day among the natural things that are around us, any one of them could become the gateway for us to realize that what my true self is really is none other than mountains and rivers, the great wide earth, the sun, the moon, the stars. I am that. Again, please take these words in a way that is intended as pointers to something that might open in us to make us realize that the earth is us. It is not separate from us. Now, given that we may tend to idealize the earth, and as we look at Zen literature also, we see how they talk of nature and trees and flowers and mountains and beautiful things in nature. But there's the tendency for those of us who read such literature to idolize or idealize this earth into such beautiful things. And of course, they are beautiful, these gifts of earth, and we realize that that is us, not separate from who I am. But also, if we look at the stark reality of the real mountains and rivers and the trees and the plants and the vegetation and also the other sentient beings, we see that the mountains are being denuded by companies that are seeking out their timber. We see the rivers being polluted by so many toxic chemicals that many factories are exuding as the byproduct or as the waste product of their manufacturing enterprises. And so that there is so much destruction going on. So those mountains are us, and we are the ones being destroyed. We are the ones that are being victimized by these activities that are not anything short of violent. So we are the ones that are also being broken and wounded in all of this. It is not just outside of us. So that second element of Earth Day, namely the crying out, the lament of our woundedness and of our impending death, comes deep in our hearts because it is us that is being affected. So again, here our Zen practice calls us. What does our Zen practice invite us to? What does our Zen practice invite us to? Facing our own death. Many of us are led to this practice precisely when we realize our own mortality, when we realize that I'm not going to live forever and I must someday die. And facing that fact that I must someday die, how may I be able to live fully so that when that moment comes, I will not have any tinge of regret and be able to say and exclaim with gratitude, it was a good ride. I have lived to the full, facing my own death. So that same spirit that motivates us, that propels us in our Zen practice, is what we are now called to take when we face not just our own individual death, but the collective death of this earth that is none other than we ourselves, facing death because of the destruction being caused by ourselves, by the way we live. We might think, I'm not the one doing that. I don't even belong to that company. I don't even receive money from that company that's doing all this. But if we look at all of the interconnected ways in which our life as a consumer, we buy goods and we consume goods, and then we also dispose of things. When we look at the way we live, we cannot but admit that we are part of that movement, part of that system that is destroying the earth, that's destroying our very own selves. So we are both the perpetrator as well as the victim of this dying earth in its cry. So in that regard, what does our Zen practice um, open up to us in terms of addressing this question of our impending collective death? There is a koan that I'd like to bring up in this regard from a well-known threesome called Tosotsu's Three Barriers. The first one goes, the purpose of seeking one's way through these tall grasses and fields and to find a master is to realize your true nature. Where, O monk, is your true nature? Right at that very moment as you go through those tall grasses and fields. That's the first one. But the more important one, the more relevant one for us is the second one. When you have realized your true nature, you will overcome, you will transcend the cycle of life and death. You will no longer fear the cycle of life and death. So how will you transcend and how will you overcome? How will you break through that cycle of life and death when you are about to die? So this is an invitation for the practitioner to actually put oneself at that point of death and actually die and see the freedom that that can bring. And this koan is very similar to the experience of Ramana Maharshi, who, as is well known, at the age of 16 had a morbid fear of death. And that morbid fear somehow led him to a life where he could not think of anything else. So at one point, seeing that he could not do anything but really face this fear, he looked at it, he sat there, and then he said, well, I will then go through this and see what it will bring me. So he lay down, closed his eyes, breathed, and imagined that these were his very last breaths, and put himself at that point of actually imagining his own death. And in going through that process of imagining his own death, somehow there was a new opening for him that liberated him from that fear and enabled him to treasure each moment of life beyond life and death. My suggestion here is to take this invitation that Ramana Maharshi took, but that also this koan, if we, so how will we free ourselves from the cycle of life and death when we are at that moment, when we are about to die, is to place ourselves at that place of the earth's death, and from that place on, look straight in the eye at what is and see what that might bring up in terms of a new life wherein we have now transcended the cycle of life and death, and we are now able to celebrate the earth and now become a part of its healing. How can we be part of the healing of this dying earth? And this is where the third aspect of Earth Day also is relevant to our practice, the call to action. What kinds of action are we called to undertake in being an instrument of healing our earth? There is a saying in a collection of koans about the Bodhisattva of compassion, which refers to actually to Kannon or Kuan Yin, our logo of our Zen community, that says, why does the Bodhisattva of compassion have so many eyes and so many arms? That itself, the koan goes on, but I'd like to take that precisely as our hint as to how our Zen practice can give us an approach to a way of being instrumental in the healing of our wounded earth. To open our eyes and to see each and everything, each and every aspect of this whole earth of ours, seeing it from the eyes of Kuan Yin, from the eyes of Kannon, that eye of awakening whereby there is no longer any separation between the seer and the seen. And so that Kuan Yin or Kannon sees and hears in a way that embodies what she sees and hears and becomes that which she sees and hears. And in seeing and hearing the cries of the world, Kuan Yin or Kannon then offers hands of healing, hands of addressing the situation. So whatever situation it may encounter, it offers a hand of healing. What particular hand of healing are we called to offer in the given situations? We are not able to map out a blueprint, but we are invited precisely to take on that spirit of Kannon in a way that what we see and what we hear are no longer things outside of us, but things that are precisely our very own selves that call us to address it with these hands of healing. And these hands of healing can be the little things that we do in our own little household when we separate the recyclable waste from the garbage, or when we save on water and try not to waste the water, or try to be more simple in our lifestyle, try not to consume things that are part of a destructive cycle, like our consumption of meat products and so on, to minimize them as much as we are able. So these are the little things that we can do in our own little lifestyle to somehow be a little more in accordance with the direction of healing. That's on the individual level. But now on the collective level, how can we raise our voice so that we may be able to call attention to the kinds of destructive things going on, so that we may be able to help in putting a stop to them in what companies are doing, or what the big powers are doing in ways that are exuding toxic waste or that are destroying resources and so on. If we see them, we know that they're not just things outside of us, but we feel the pain of the earth. And so then that pain itself that we feel as our very own pain is what inspires us to offer a hand or offer a voice that might stem that destruction. All of these are not separate from our practice of sitting in stillness, breathing with awareness, and allowing our heart and mind to open up and embrace the universe of all that there is. This is not just an idealized or an aesthetic project, but this is precisely a project of life and death. Each breath that we take brings us into that intimate interconnectedness with this whole earth, with this whole universe throbbing with life. And as we feel that life throbbing in us, then that life itself is what leads us to live in a way out of our cushion in our action, in our home and in the streets and in the public fora, to be able to send forth those arms and raise those voices that may be in the direction of healing our earth. So I would like to conclude this short talk again with the invitation of continuing to receive the nourishment that we need in this engagement in our stillness. In our immersing in this stillness, we find the nourishment for our own life 24/7, and it is where we can also find the vision that will guide our actions in the direction of healing and enable us to become instruments of that healing as empowered by what we receive in the stillness. And as we open our eyes in that stillness, and as we see through those walls that separate us from what we think is outside of us and become truly aware of the fact that there is no wall between myself and the earth, between myself and each and everyone else, then we may be able to celebrate this life together in a way that is beyond the fear of life and death, but simply celebrate the fullness of life right here in each moment and be able to live in a way that is celebrating that life and in a way that will always affirm and be grateful for each and everything that this life brings.
Boundless compassion. Absorbing your sounds awakens the Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices. In the light recall this, in the dark recall this. Moment after moment the true heart arises. Time after time there is nothing but this. Absorbing your sounds awakens the Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of compassion. This Buddha receives only compassion. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, just compassion. Thus the pure heart always rejoices. In the light recalls it, in the dark recalls it. Moment after moment the true heart arises. Time after time there is nothing but this. Absorbing world sounds awakens the Buddha right here. This Buddha, the source of this moment after moment, the true heart arises. Time after time, there is nothing